Wyoming Territory, 1871. The sun baked the dust into cracked veins across the earth. Buzzards spun lazy circles overhead, waiting for something or someone to fall. A cattle auction was underway, with the lowing of steers drowned by the bark of men placing bets. But off to the side, chained together like broken furniture, sat three small figures, burlap sacks over their heads, wrists bound with frayed rope. They didn't move, not even when laughter rose around them. Standing apart from the crowd was Marin Calloway, 33. Her black dress clung to her thin frame like mourning cloth to a coffin. One hand clutched a velvet pouch. The other rested on the handle of the knife tucked into her belt. The auctioneer laughed from the makeshift stage. 3 for 1 silver coin, or a single gold ring. The children didn't flinch, but Marin did. She stepped forward, slowly, pulled her wedding ring off, held it high. Silence fell. The crowd scoffed. A ring for them? You'd get more warmth from a rattler's nest, someone shouted. But Marin didn't flinch. Her ring gleamed briefly in the light before the auctioneer snatched it up, biting it like it was doubloon gold. She ignored him, walked straight to the children. Their sacks were old potato bags, filthy, threadbare. Marin knelt, gently untied the knots. The sacks fell. 3 faces stared up at her, dirt-smudged, sunburned, hollow-eyed, but not wild, not feral, just lost. The girl in front, maybe 9, blinked rapidly like the sun hurt her eyes. The boy beside her was smaller, stiff, with rope burns on his wrists. The smallest one, barely more than a toddler, leaned against the girl and wouldn't look up. No one said a word. The auctioneer shrugged. Yours now, lady. No refunds. The crowd dispersed. Cattle bawled behind them, uninterested. Marin led the children away slowly, her jaw clenched. Each child took a step with the kind of hesitance that came from being dragged too many times. Someone whispered behind her, "There goes the crazy widow, bought herself ghosts." But Marin wasn't listening. She'd once had a husband, John Calloway, a cattle driver, brave, a little foolish, killed by border raiders just a year ago, ambushed while defending a waterhole. No children, just the memory of trying, the memory of failing, and a wedding ring, the last thing she owned that hadn't been taken. Until now, Marin didn't see wildness in the children. She saw silence, the kind you earn by losing too much, too fast. The road home was rough. Dust kicked up in waves behind the mare pulling the rickety wagon. Marin offered the children space inside, but they wouldn't take it. They walked behind the wagon barefoot, silent. The sun dropped low. Coyotes howled somewhere distant. At her cabin, a lopsided structure hidden in the holler below Dead Horse Ridge, Marin set a stew to boil. The children huddled outside. She called them in. They didn't move. She brought out bowls, left them on the porch, then stepped away. They ate like animals, quick, quiet, barely swallowing before taking the next bite. Later, she coaxed them to the barn, offered blankets, hay, water. Still nothing said. By nightfall, her patience cracked. "You're safe now. You're not dogs anymore," she shouted at them, voice raw. "At least say something." The eldest girl, the one with pale gray eyes, stepped in front of the others. Didn't blink, didn't cry, just stood there, shielding them. Marin turned and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind her. But sleep didn't come. Hours later, she peeked out. The girl, Tessa, she would learn, was wrapping a strip of cloth around the boy's feet. Her own dress, torn. The boy winced. She blew on his toes to ease the sting. The little one, Ruth, had finally curled into Tessa's lap. Marin's chest ached. Not from grief. Not exactly. From guilt. She grabbed a lantern, a log, matches. She built a second fire. Outside. Just close enough to keep them warm. She didn't say a word. Back inside, she sat on the edge of her bed, the side where her husband used to sleep. She whispered into the dark, voice shaking, "I don't know what I'm doing." That night, as the outside fire crackled low, something else stirred beyond the treeline. Not a coyote, not a man with boots. Something quieter, older, patient. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, still as stone, wrapped in deerskin. He watched the children sleep in the glow of the firelight, arms wrapped around each other like stray pups in winter. His face was shadowed, but sharp, long black hair braided behind one shoulder. A thin necklace of carved bone and hawk feathers lay across his chest. He wore no gun, just a blade tied to his waist with rawhide. Around his neck, a silver ring, cracked in half, hung on sinew. He moved like mist, silent, invisible. When he stepped back into the forest, he left something behind. A rabbit, skinned, still warm. At dawn, Marin stepped outside to feed the chickens and froze. There it was, laid carefully beside the fire pit. No tracks in the dirt, no blood trail, just the rabbit. She crouched beside it, frowning. Inside the cabin, the stew pot boiled again. Tessa tasted it. For the first time since arriving, Eli smiled. The days passed like slow-moving cloud shadows across the prairie. Time softened around the small cabin, tucked between rustling cottonwoods and the murmur of the nearby creek. Marin rose before the sun, and now, so did the children. She taught them gently, not with lectures, but with hands-on work. Ruth, the smallest, was assigned to collect eggs, her tiny fingers reaching cautiously beneath fluffed feathers. Eli, still silent, helped her feed the goats, his solemn eyes always scanning the edges of the property. And Tessa, ever watchful, helped chop kindling and boil water for morning tea. Sometimes Marin would catch them glancing at her, uncertain but no longer afraid. One afternoon, as they gathered around the fire to eat, Ruth began to hum, a tuneless little song of her own invention. The sound froze Marin mid-stir, heart aching. It was the first music that had touched the cabin since John died. That same evening, as Marin helped Tessa mend a torn shawl, the girl finally spoke. "We ain't going back," she said, quiet but firm. Marin looked into those flint-gray eyes, full of something far older than a 9-year-old should carry, and nodded. "No, child," Marin whispered, brushing a lock of hair from Tessa's cheek. "You're not." They began sleeping inside soon after. All 3 children curled into one bed like kittens, blankets tangled and limbs overlapping. Tessa always slept on the edge, protector still. Marin stood by the mantel that night, staring at the faded photo of her husband, John Calloway, all dressed in wool and sunlight. Then, slowly, she took the frame down. In its place, she hung the burlap sacks, freshly washed, stitched with small colored threads by Ruth's fingers. They hung like ghosts no longer, but badges of survival. And in the silence that followed, something warm began to take root. The wind shifted overnight. The next morning, a low groan rolled across the valley, deepened slow like the growl of some great beast waking in the hills. By midday, the clouds boiled black, bloated with rain. The goats bleated nervously. The hens wouldn't leave the coop. Then the sky split. A thunder crack, so sharp it rattled the windows. Lightning snapped a tree clean in half, the old cottonwood near the barn. Marin flung open the door. "We need to move the stock, now." She barely had time to grab her slicker before racing into the gale. The wind clawed at her hair, driving rain sideways like buckshot. Tessa appeared behind her, soaked but steady. Eli followed, carrying a half-empty bucket. They threw open the barn doors just as another bolt struck the ridge. Inside, the horses kicked against the stalls. One slipped loose, eyes wild, and crashed past Marin, hooves skimming her hip. She fell hard onto the mud-slicked ground. Ruth screamed from the porch. Her tiny voice cracked through the thunder. The barn creaked, ready to come down. Tessa and Eli dragged Maren clear just as a beam snapped, crashing where her head had been. Together, they crawled back toward the house, drenched and heaving, pulling her body between them. Inside, Ruth sobbed and pulled blankets from the bed. Maren's eyes fluttered. Her lips were blue. And then darkness. The fire crackled softly. Rain still pattered against the windows, but inside the cabin, warmth returned. Maren's fever broke sometime before dawn. Her eyelids fluttered open, breath raspy, body weak. Shapes moved in her blurred vision. The children, sleeping near the hearth, curled up together like fawns. And then another figure, tall, silent, kneeling at her bedside. A hand pressed a damp cloth to her brow. The scent of smoke and earth lingered. She blinked. Crow that walks. The man from the trees. No words were exchanged. Just a quiet nod. He rose and tended the fire, stoking it higher. Outside, the chickens stirred. The goats brayed, fed. By the time the sun kissed the horizon, he was gone. But in the corner of the room, carved from soft pine, sat a small wooden bear with button eyes. Ruth would find it first. Later, a flint knife, sized perfectly for a child's hand, appeared on Eli's shelf. No one saw him leave either gift. But each time, the fire was higher, the traps reset, and the forest felt less like a threat, more like a sentinel. Trust, like the slow melt of spring snow, had begun. It was a warm, brittle morning when the threat returned, but this time not in thunder. Hoofbeats. 5 riders, dust-covered and sneering, approached from the east. Maren stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The man at the front wore a wide-brimmed hat and arrogance like a second skin. Cal Tulliver, cattle boss, land baron, a man who paid his debts in pain. Well, he said, smiling like a knife. Didn't expect to find you playing house with my property. Maren didn't blink. They're not yours. He spit into the dirt. They're survivors from a raid. My men took that wagon train fair and square. There's a bounty on all 3, unclaimed. Until now. Behind him, one rider chuckled. Another fingered his revolver. They're children, Maren said. Her voice didn't shake. You'll leave now. Cal's smile thinned. The law don't matter out here, Miss Calloway. The land does. And I own the land. His eyes flicked to the burlap sacks still hanging above her door. A cruel smile touched his lips. Sentimental touch, he muttered, then turned his horse. 3 nights, he called over his shoulder. Then we come collect what's ours. Dust rose behind them as they rode off. That evening, Maren sat at the fire, rifle across her knees. The children were silent, but their fear hung heavy in the room. Then a knock, not loud, not rushed. She opened the door. Crow that walks stood there, wind in his hair, eyes like stormstone. He said only one thing. They will come with fire. Maren met his gaze. Then she turned toward the back room, opened the gun cabinet, and began checking rounds. Then we meet them with smoke. The hills were quiet, too quiet, the kind that comes before blood. Maren worked with urgency in her limbs, but a calm settled in her bones. This wasn't panic. This was purpose. She boarded up the cabin's windows with split pine and hammered nails until her hands bled. Tessa and Eli stood beside her, holding boards steady. Then, under the oil lamp's glow, she handed them both rifles. She knelt beside them. These ain't toys, she said. You don't point unless you mean it. You don't fire unless there's no other choice. Tessa nodded, jaw tight. Eli said nothing, but his hands gripped the rifle stock like it anchored him to the earth. Out back, Ruth helped Maren dig a shallow pit beneath the willow tree by the well. They buried sacks of flour, beans, and a jar of sugar. "It's just in case," Marin whispered, brushing the girl's tangled hair back. Nearby, Crow That Walks moved like wind through tall grass. He set hidden snares at the tree line, tripwires tied to rusted saw blades. In the shadows along the trail, he poured a trail of oil behind dry brush, stones ready to spark fire. At dusk, Marin finally sat them all down by the hearth. She held her old bonnet in her lap, stroking the fraying edge. "There was another," she said softly. "Before John died. A child. A boy. The fire popped. Born too early. Never breathed once." Tessa reached across and placed her hand over Marin's. No words. Marin finally exhaled. "I buried his name. I never said it out loud until now. His name was Caleb." Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters. Inside, a family huddled, not born of blood, but fire and choice. The sky bled orange at the edges when the hooves came. 5 riders silhouetted by torchlight, creeping up the ridge like phantoms. Marin was already on the porch, rifle raised, eyes unblinking. Keltulliver called out, loud and smug, "Bring the orphans out, or we'll take M screaming." Marin didn't answer. She just pulled the trigger. Boom. One of Tulliver's men dropped, leg shredded by buckshot. Chaos erupted. Gunfire spat through the air. Splinters flew from the porch beams. Inside, Eli crouched by the window. He raised the rifle like Marin taught, trembling. He fired once, missed, but the shot startled the rider aiming for the back door. That gave Crow That Walks just enough time. A blur of movement from the trees. Whip. An arrow lodged in a rider's throat. Another followed, straight into the gut of the man dismounting by the barn. But it was Tulliver who laughed. "Burn him out." He hurled a torch onto the barn roof. Flames leapt like snakes on dry timber. Ruth screamed. Marin turned, sprinted into the smoke. The barn was already a furnace. She shielded the child with her shawl and dove through a burst of cinders. A bullet tore past her, grazing her arm. She hit the dirt, rolled, kept running. Inside the cabin, Tessa screamed as a rider leapt through the broken window. He lunged for Eli, grabbed his shirt. Tessa stabbed him with a kitchen knife. No hesitation, right in the thigh. He fell, cursing. Crow That Walks burst through the back. Bow dropped, wielding his knife now, fast, silent, deadly. He brought down the rider before the man could crawl to his pistol. Blood soaked the floorboards. Outside, Tulliver tried to flee. Marin raised her rifle one last time. Crack! His horse bucked. Tulliver tumbled, screaming, leg shattered. He crawled away into the brush, leaving a trail behind him. The flames licked the barn skeleton. Smoke billowed into the sky. The ranch groaned, but stood. When the sun finally broke through the smoke, it painted the valley in ghost light. The barn was ash. The yard smelled of blood, smoke, and scorched hide. Marin collapsed beside the well, clutching her wounded arm. The children huddled beside her. Eli pressed a damp cloth to her head. Ruth wept softly into her skirt. Tessa stood watch, with the rifle across her lap. Crow That Walks, bleeding from a slash across the ribs, sat quietly in the shadow of the willow. He opened a pouch, filled with herbs, twine, and bone, and placed it at Marin's feet. Then he rose, as silent as ever, and disappeared into the hills without a word. By evening, the fire was out. The children refused to sleep apart. Marin didn't make them. In the morning, she tied a strip of her old wedding dress around Tessa's wrist, not as a tether to the past, but a bond forged in blood and fire. The house creaked, but it stood, and so did they. Weeks passed. The cabin healed slowly. So did Marin. But the scars, those stayed, and so did the children. One crisp morning, Marin packed a bundle and saddled the old mare. With the children trailing behind, they followed a narrow trail westward, up into the mountain passes where the air grew thinner and the sky opened wide. At the foot of a wild rose bush, she stopped. There, beneath the soft petals, she'd buried the faded photograph of her husband. Her fingers trembled as she whispered, "You gave me strength, but they gave me life." At the peak, where the trail met the horizon, a small Cherokee settlement shimmered between tall pines. A hawk circled overhead. Crow that walks waited beneath a cedar. He nodded once, solemn, acknowledging their survival. The children looked up, no longer afraid. As they walked forward, Tessa took Marin's hand. Eli tugged her sleeve. When she looked down, he spoke for the first time. "Mama." Marin froze, then smiled. She looked back once, to the ranch far below, the ashes, the memories, and then forward, to mountains, to sky, to hope. "Yes," she said softly, "I am."